Hi everybody, you're listening to Comics and History, episode number 116, part 4, Spotlight on Green Lantern Alan Scott during the Pre-Flashpoint era, continued. Welcome to the show. I am your host, Brian J. Rygate, and class is back in session. And folks, we are getting towards the 3-hour mark with this recording, looking at the career of DC's original Green Lantern, Alan Scott. I'm pretty sure that we're going to need another installment after this, meaning that thanks to the bi-weekly schedule, this look at Alan Scott will have run for well over 2 months. So for those of you guys who decide to let these recordings sit and then listen to them all in one go, good on you. For those of you who are waiting every 2 weeks for the installment, there is a green light coming towards the end of the tunnel. But again, I'm such a big Alan Scott fan, and I'm sure that many of you out there are big Green Lantern Alan Scott fans as well. And so you don't mind me taking this much time to look at Alan's career. Certainly I don't mind at all. But enough rambling. Let's get into it. So at the end of part 3, I mentioned that I would start off by talking about Infinite Crisis, and so I'm going to do that right now. Infinite Crisis was billed as the true sequel to Crisis on Infinite Earths. As I mentioned in my Cole's Notes series on DC's Legends, Legends wasn't meant to be a sequel to Crisis on Infinite Earths. That was the buzzword around the DC offices at the time. But Legends' real purpose was exploring the landscape of the newly created post-crisis DC universe. And then Zero Hour was more of a soft reboot, if you will, for DC Universe. It was really more of a house cleaning initiative, and even though the full title was 0 Hour Crisis in Time, it wasn't really meant to be a sequel to Crisis. But certainly at the 20-year anniversary of the Crisis, it was time for that long-awaited sequel, and indeed Infinite Crisis would follow a number of story beats in echo of the original Crisis, much the way that Star Wars The Force Awakens follows similar story beats to the original Star Wars A New Hope. And so what was interesting in the opening issue of Infinite Crisis is that Alan was tapped to be a member of a group of heroes who went into space to investigate the growing cosmic mumbo-jumbo that was going on out amongst the stars. And it was interesting because, and this was stated quite explicitly in a story which I'm actually going to review at the end of episode 116, an issue from the DC First series back in 2002. The idea that Alan wasn't so comfortable about going into space in comparison to Hal Jordan and other members of the Green Lantern Corps. Alan was more at home on Earth, outside of his appearances in those Silver Age, JLA, JSA team-up stories. Alan's place really was on Earth, while he left it to Hal to be the one to go and deal with issues in space. But maybe it was because his daughter Jade was going into space. Maybe she talked him into going with her. Maybe she presented to him the idea that since he was one of the strongest members of the DCU, it was actually important that they have someone of his power level out in space. But in any event, that was Alan's role at the start of Infinite Crisis. Now, Crisis on Infinite Earths had a number of tie-in issues which came from the regular ongoing titles at the time. And Infinite Crisis did that too. I want to say that pretty well every ongoing solo title within the DC catalog in 2005-2006 crossed over with Infinite Crisis, but Jeff Johns and company took it one step further by producing 4 miniseries which tied in with the larger event. And Alan didn't appear in this one miniseries which was titled Ron Thanagar War. However, he would be involved in the follow-up issue that sort of told the epilogue to the story of the Ran Thanagar War. Essentially, in that miniseries, Superboy Prime, who was one of the instigators in the coming of this new crisis, had shifted either Ron or Thanagar so that the 2 planets were in dangerously close contact with each other, and it set off a war between the 2 planets. And it was up to the trio of Hawkman Carter Hall, Green Lantern Kyle Rayner, and hero of both Earth and Ron, Adam Strange, to help stop the war, bring about a peace, and determine what exactly caused these 2 worlds to come into such dangerous proximity to each other. And in the issue, the Ron Thanagar War special that followed the conclusion of the 4-parter, Alan's team were in the general vicinity of Ran and Thanagar, and that's where something which devastated Alan occurred. Alexander Luthor was also one of the antagonists of Infinite Crisis, and he, along with Superboy Prime, were attempting to create what they felt was the perfect Earth. For Superboy Prime, that was the old Earth Prime. For Alexander Luthor, though, he was going quite mad, experimenting with creating different Earths and then smashing them together. And at one point, Jade got in the way of Alexander Luthor, and he ended up blasting her with a lethal amount of cosmic energy, which killed her. And Alan saw his daughter go down. He caught her, held her in his arms as she breathed her last. And there's a very unfortunate coloring error which exists in both the original single issue of the special, and the error sadly made its way into the collected edition. Essentially, as Jenny breathes her last, Alan looks at her and he says, "Jenny, you're you again." And what it meant was that Jenny, whose skin had been green for a number of years and seemed to be permanently green, reverted to its original Caucasian flesh tone, and her hair turned brown again. And Alan was commenting on this, but the gaffe stayed through the collected edition, and I don't know if I want to plunk down a few dollars and get the digital edition, see if maybe it got fixed there. But suffice to say, the real killer for Alan was that there would be no body to bring back to Barry, as Jenny's body appeared to entirely disintegrate. Well, disintegrate might be too strong a word. Rather, Jenny's body turned into complete energy, the cloud of which actually went into the body of Kyle Rayner and transformed him into Ion for the second time. And so it was up to Kyle as the newly enlightened Ion to kind of break it gently to Alan to say that, yes, in a physical sense, Jenny was dead. However, her energy existed within Kyle now. Her energy was everywhere. And so Alan, as he had to do on other occasions, had to basically pick up the pieces right there and carry on, this time following Ion, as he looked to help the other heroes to resolve the growing crisis in space. And I know this is not a Jade Spotlight episode, but given that she is the daughter of the Golden Age Green Lantern, I think I should spend a couple minutes to talk about Jade's part in Kyle's transformation into the second Ion. Now, first off, when Kyle first became Ion in the Power of Ion storyline, he had near godlike abilities. But this time around, he didn't seem to have that same level of power. He was certainly given a very creepy look with this new Ion costume, and thank goodness that wiser heads prevailed, that by the halfway point of his 12-part series, which followed Infinite Crisis, he went back to wearing a standard Green Lantern mask. But the explanation in the Rann-Thanagar War special was that the Guardians had been looking for some time to see a merger of the Green Lantern Corps energy with the Starheart, and that was what had come to pass. Here, Kyle now represented a merger between the Green Lantern Corps energy and the power of the Starheart. And that was something which didn't last too long. Certainly when Sinestro Corps War took place, in the opening chapter of that story, it was explained that Ion was the living entity of will, much along the line that Parallax was the living entity of fear. And there was no more talk about Ion having anything to do with the Starheart. So where exactly did this idea come from then in Rann-Thanagar, in the Rann-Thanagar special? And I do have to agree with former Lantern Cast co-host Jim Ford that when Kyle, as Ion in his first go-round, restored Jenny's powers, he probably didn't really give her back her Starheart powers. Rather, Mr. Ford suggested that Kyle had imbued Jade with a small piece of the Ion entity, and so that allowed her to manifest powers that were much along the lines of the Starheart. And so when Jenny died in Infinite Crisis, what was happening was that that small piece of the Ion entity was simply going back into Kyle. And we didn't see it on panel, but what was really happening was the Ion entity was entering Kyle. And the reason why Kyle wasn't so godlike this time was because he was taking in the Ion entity, but he wasn't taking in the whole of the Green Lantern Corps' central power battery's power. In any event, I just wanted to touch upon that theory for anybody who wanted to consider